Hello, my name is Kathy Mazak, and I'm a researcher who looks at bilingualism in higher education in Puerto Rico. In this short lecture, I'm going to talk about planning research by showing you a worked example of a study that I've done. First, I started with the research problem. I was really interested in the fact that my university calls itself bilingual, and my university is the premier science and um, maths kind of engineering STEM university in Puerto Rico. And there definitely is a lot of English language use, particularly in text. So I was interested in examining that phenomenon. So I wanted to look at the use of English text in a Spanish language environment. Philipson, 2009, calls many higher education environments bilingual in all but name. So is very common around the world and very, very common in Puerto Rico to use English texts and talk about them in Spanish and maybe switch out the keywords. So I was very interested in learning more about this phenomenon. I came up with these research questions based on that area of inquiry. What strategies do Spanish-speaking students at the UPRM employ to negotiate the uses of English in their content courses? And then these sub-questions. What languages do students use to talk about English texts in and out of classrooms? How do students use peer networks to access content in English? What reading strategies do students employ when faced with materials in English? How do students understand and use key scientific terms in English? And how do students use material in English to prepare for assessment measures in Spanish? Number 2, how do professors talk about texts in English? What languages do they use? What learning strategies are evident in their talk around text? And finally, what are the characteristics in terms of genre, style, lexicon, etc. of the English texts being used? For example, textbook presentations, lab guides, that kind of stuff, being used by students. This project was a giant research project that had many parts that led to many different types of publications. So the methodology I decided to employ was ethnographic case study. So I started by thinking about my methods. So for participant selection or sampling, I used classrooms at the UPRM where I knew particular types of bilingual talk and bilingual reading were going on. So I actually did a series of ethnographic case studies. Two that I'll talk about here specifically. One was with an agriculture professor who was Puerto Rican and was delivering his class using English text but talking in Spanish. And another qualitative ethnographic case study was of a psychology professor who was originally from the US but also spoke Spanish very fluently, and she would let her students use whatever language they wanted in class and on exams, which was really rather unusual to let students choose the language that they answered exam questions on, and they were able to even very fluidly use different languages to answer different questions even. It was a very interesting case. The researcher role, I was very clear that I'm also a professor at the university where the study was taking place, and that I was not a member of the classes, but kind of sat in on them. For data collection instruments, I collected ethnographic data, which included field notes of observations in and out of class, materials that I collected, such as student notes, audio recordings of classes, assessment measures, so the tests that the students took, I collected, assigned readings, and then I also did interviews with both professors and students. And we actually didn't end up doing this part of the study, but we thought about doing introspective data, which are think aloud protocols about readings and diagrams. So that's when you ask students to look at something that they're reading and give you kind of like a running narrative of what's going on in their heads. We actually didn't end up doing that though. So the data analysis, we analyzed two ways. We chunked the data into literacy events and cultural practices. That was the framework that we were using. We also used critical discourse analysis. And in this chart, it shows you the three main research questions, the data that answered the questions, and the type of analysis that we did. Now, when you're designing a research study, this is a really important thing to do. Once you have questions, match up those questions with the type of data that you're going to collect, and then also talk about how you will analyze that data. So that's what this chart is: the research question, those data sources that answer that question, and then my method of analysis for those different pieces of data. So we should always think about reliability and validity. So for me, in this qualitative study, I was increasing validity by using thick description, situated data, trying to understand the phenomenon from the participant's point of view with member checks, which we did through the interviews, inductive data analysis, research reflexivity, so my positionality and the other research assistants that I had, but that was very clear in terms of our positionality, the interpretive nature of accounts, participant checking, and triangulation. And we also sought for reliability in terms of the clearness of our instruments and other measures of reliability. The implications of the study, we were looking at the naming this phenomenon bilingual, when sometimes it doesn't get called bilingual, or it's called receptive bilingualism, which is sometimes seen as being a deficit perspective. Also, we were informing or giving concrete examples of a heteroglossic ideology of bilingualism. So this was a real world example of everyday lives, and we wanted to give a description of these practices to build on the practices that there are. We wanted to know what students were doing so that then we could be better teachers of both language and content. So that is my worked example, and I hope it was useful to see some of the things we've been talking about in the class illustrated in a real world example.